Mafia boss's chubby secretary showed up to the gala looking stunning, spent the whole night laughing and dancing with a stranger, and didn't notice him watching every single second. But what he overheard near the exit that night had nothing to do with romance, and suddenly, he couldn't let it go. The charity gala was exactly the kind of event Ryan Mercer hated. Too many people pretending to care about causes they'd forget by morning, too much champagne, too many handshakes with men whose smiles never reached their eyes. He'd been doing this for 15 years, attending these things, writing the checks, playing the part, and it had never once felt natural. But he came anyway, because in his world, being seen mattered more than being comfortable. He adjusted his cufflinks and scanned the ballroom from the top of the entrance steps. Crystal chandeliers hung above a sea of black tuxedos and floor-length gowns. The orchestra was playing something soft and forgettable near the far wall. Waiters moved through the crowd like ghosts, balancing trays of champagne flutes that nobody actually needed. Hannah was already somewhere inside. She'd arrived 30 minutes before him, which was typical. She always arrived early, always had the itinerary memorized before he even looked at it. 5 years she'd worked for him, and in that time she'd become the most reliable person in his life, which, if he was being honest with himself, wasn't saying much about the rest of his life. He spotted her near the center of the room. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, fitted and elegant, her dark hair pinned up with a few loose curls falling around her face. She was laughing at something, head tilted back, completely unguarded, and Ryan found himself pausing on the steps longer than he intended. He'd never seen her laugh like that at the office. He made his way down and was immediately pulled into a conversation with 2 men from the Chicago Business Council. He shook hands, smiled at the right moments, answered questions about the Harrison Street development project. He was good at this part, going through the motions while his mind stayed somewhere else entirely. Except tonight, his mind kept drifting back across the room. He glanced over his shoulder once. Hannah was still talking with the same group, still animated, still laughing. He turned back to his conversation. One of the men was saying something about tax incentives. Ryan nodded. 20 minutes passed. He excused himself, picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, and moved along the edge of the ballroom. He had 3 more people to find before the evening was over: a city commissioner, a real estate developer from New York, and a woman who ran the largest private foundation in Illinois. He pulled out his phone to check the time. That's when he saw her on the dance floor. Hannah was dancing with a man Ryan had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit the way a gala suit should. Not someone from this world. The man was saying something close to her ear, and Hannah laughed again. That same open, unguarded laugh. And Ryan felt something shift in his chest so suddenly it almost caught him off guard. He stood completely still. The man was leading her well, turning her gently, and Hannah moved with an ease Ryan had never associated with her. At the office, she was composed, precise, always slightly formal. The woman on that dance floor looked like someone he was only now meeting for the first time. He didn't like it. He didn't like the way the man's hand rested at her waist. He didn't like how comfortably close they stood. He didn't like the way she seemed completely relaxed, in a way she almost never was around him. Ryan set his glass down on a nearby table without looking. He told himself it was concern. She was his employee, after all. He didn't know this man. It was reasonable to be cautious. That's what he told himself.
But he stayed exactly where he was and watched. The song ended. Hannah and the man stepped off the floor and moved toward the quieter side of the room near the terrace doors. Ryan found himself moving in the same direction, keeping a distance, weaving between conversations without joining any of them. He was close enough to hear their voices, but kept his back slightly turned, pretending to check his phone. I wasn't expecting to run into you here, Hannah was saying.
Honestly, me neither, the man replied. His voice was easy, unhurried. I was doing a job nearby and ended up staying in the city an extra night. A friend had an extra ticket.
Of all the charity galas in Chicago.
Right? He laughed. Then his voice dropped slightly, just enough that Ryan had to stay very still to catch it. Listen, I didn't want to bring this up tonight, but I found another clue about the storage unit. The words landed like something cold. Ryan didn't move. Hannah's response was quiet.
Are you serious? Where?
Same building we talked about. There was something hidden I almost missed. I'll explain everything tomorrow.
Ethan.
Not here, the man said gently. Tomorrow. Ryan pocketed his phone slowly. Storage unit. Clue. A name he'd never heard Hannah mention. Ethan. For 5 years, Hannah had sat outside his office, managed his schedule, answered his calls, attended every meeting, every trip, every event, exactly like this one. He thought he knew her routine the way he knew his own. He thought he knew what her life looked like outside of work. Quiet, organized, predictable. He'd been wrong. The orchestra began another song. Around him, conversations continued, glasses clinked. The evening carried on exactly as planned. But Ryan Mercer stood at the edge of the ballroom with his mind somewhere else entirely, watching Hannah walk back toward the crowd with a man named Ethan and a secret she'd never told him. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no idea what was happening in someone else's life. The feeling was deeply, uncomfortably unfamiliar. Ryan didn't sleep well. He told himself it was work. There was always something, a deal pending, a contract dispute, a city permit taking longer than it should. He'd spent years training his mind to carry problems into the night and sort through them while the rest of the world rested. It was one of the reasons he was good at what he did. But at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment with the city glowing quietly outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, he knew it wasn't work keeping him awake. It was 2 words. Storage unit. He sat up, reached for the glass of water on his nightstand, and thought about the way Hannah's voice had changed when Ethan said it. Quiet. Careful. Like someone protecting something they weren't ready to share. He'd been her employer for 5 years. She knew things about his business that most people in his inner circle didn't know. And somehow, in all that time, she'd carried something entirely her own without ever letting it show. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. By 6 a.m, he was already at his desk. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ask Marcus, his head of security, to run a background check. He pulled up what he could find on his own. Public records, business registrations, a basic search on the name Ethan Parker. What came back was straightforward. Ethan Parker, 34 years old, ran a small independent auto repair shop on the west side of Chicago. No criminal record, no business connections to anyone Ryan knew, no red flags of any kind. Just a mechanic. Ryan leaned back in his chair and looked at the search results for a long moment. A mechanic who attended charity galas and knew about hidden clues inside buildings. He closed the laptop. He had Marcus drive him to the office at the usual time.
Hannah was already at her desk when he walked in, coffee ready, his morning schedule printed and waiting. She greeted him the same way she always did, calm, efficient, a small, professional smile. Nothing in her expression suggested the previous evening had meant anything unusual. Ryan sat down at his desk and got through 2 hours of calls without losing focus. He was proud of that. At 10:30, He watched through the glass partition as Hannah picked up her personal phone, read something on the screen, and quietly gathered her bag. She leaned toward the intercom. "Mr. Mercer, I have a personal errand during my lunch break. I'll be back by 1. It was barely 11 o'clock. "Of course," he said. He waited exactly 4 minutes after she left, then told Marcus to bring the car around. Following someone without being noticed in Chicago traffic required patience and the right vehicle. Ryan sat in the back of a dark gray sedan that nobody would look at twice and kept a comfortable distance while Marcus drove. Hannah moved through the city on foot, which made things easier. She walked 6 blocks east, turned onto a quieter street lined with small businesses and coffee shops, and stopped in front of a place called Brennan's, a narrow cafe with a green awning and fogged windows. Ethan was already inside. Ryan could see them through the window from across the street. A corner table, slightly away from the other customers. Between them, spread across the table, were papers, old ones from the look of it. Maps, maybe, documents. Ethan had a folder open and was pointing at something while Hannah leaned forward, her reading glasses on, studying whatever was in front of her. This was not a romantic meeting. Ryan had spent enough time in rooms where people conducted serious business to recognize the difference. These two weren't catching up or flirting over coffee. They were working through something that mattered. He stayed in the car and watched. After 40 minutes, they began gathering everything back into the folder. Hannah said something, and Ethan nodded, tapping the cover of the folder twice like he was confirming a point. They stood, shook hands, which struck Ryan as oddly formal for two people who had danced together the night before, and walked out separately. Ryan was back at the office before Hannah returned. She came in at 5 minutes to 1, exactly as promised, and went straight back to work without mentioning where she'd been. Ryan spent the next hour trying to decide whether to ask her directly. He drafted the question in his head 3 different ways. Each version sounded either intrusive or suspicious. He let it go. Instead, just before the end of the day, he walked out to her desk with a contract that needed reviewing and set it down in front of her. "Hannah," she looked up. "Is everything all right? You seemed a little distracted this morning." It was a gentle opening, not quite a question, an invitation if she wanted to take it. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved behind her eyes, a small debate happening quickly. Then she looked back down at her desk. "I've been dealing with something personal," she said. "It's nothing that affects work. I'm handling it." "Okay," he said simply, "but if you need anything—" "I'm fine, Mr. Mercer, thank you." He nodded and walked back to his office. He sat down, loosened his tie, and stared at the partition between them. She was searching for a storage unit that didn't exist in any current records. Her father had apparently left it behind, and she was doing it completely alone. Except for a mechanic named Ethan she trusted enough to meet in secret. The question wasn't whether she needed help. The question was why she hadn't asked him. Ryan made a decision that evening. He wasn't going to wait for Hannah to come to him. That approach had already proven itself useless. She was too private, too careful, and clearly too determined to handle things on her own. If he waited for her to open up voluntarily, he'd be waiting a long time. So the next morning, when Hannah arrived at the office and found Ryan already standing at her desk with his jacket on and his car keys in his hand, she stopped in the doorway. "You're not in your office," she said. Observant as always. He held up a coffee, her usual order, oat milk, 1 sugar, and set it on her desk. "I know about the storage unit." The color shifted slightly in her face. Not dramatic, just a small tightening around her eyes. "How?" It wasn't a question. It was the tone of someone mentally retracing their steps. "I overheard part of your conversation at the gala," he said. "I wasn't trying to, but I heard enough." He paused. "You're looking for something your father left behind, and you can't locate it because the unit number doesn't match any current records." Hannah set her bag down slowly. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through whether to be annoyed or relieved. "I didn't want to bother you with it," she finally said.
It's not a bother.
Ryan,
Let me help. He said it simply. No negotiation built into it, just an offer sitting on the table. She picked up her coffee, took a sip, looked out the window at the street below.
Ethan thinks he found something in the old industrial district, she said quietly. An office building connected to my father's company records. We were going to check it today.
Then let's go. Ethan was already waiting outside the building when they arrived, a 6-story structure on the edge of the industrial district that had clearly been emptying out for years. Half the windows were boarded. A demolition notice was taped to the front door, dated 3 weeks from now. Whatever was inside had a short shelf life. Ethan's expression shifted slightly when he saw Ryan step out of the car behind Hannah. He recovered quickly and extended a hand. "Ethan Parker."
Ryan Mercer.
Ryan shook it. "Hannah told me what you've been working on. I'd like to help if I can." Ethan glanced at Hannah. She gave a small nod that seemed to settle something between them, and Ethan pushed open the building's side entrance without further discussion. Inside, the building smelled like old paper and damp concrete. Most of the offices on the ground floor had been cleared out, leaving behind outlines on the carpet where furniture used to sit, and faded rectangles on the walls where framed things had hung. The kind of emptiness that felt recent rather than old. They took the stairs to the 3rd floor, where Ethan led them down a corridor to a corner office at the far end. "Your father's company leased space in this building about 12 years ago," Ethan explained as he walked. "It was a short lease, 18 months, but in the old building records, this specific office is listed under a slightly different company name, 1 letter off from the main company name."
He used variations of the company name for different purposes, Hannah said. I found that pattern in some of his papers after he passed.
Exactly, which is why nobody connected this space to him in the property records. The corner office was small. A built-in bookshelf ran along one wall, completely bare. Ethan crossed to it immediately and began running his hand along the back panel of the lowest shelf, pressing in different places. Ryan watched without comment. On the 3rd press, something gave. A section of the back panel shifted inward about an inch, and Ethan carefully worked his fingers along the edge and pulled it free. Behind it, tucked flat against the wall, was a ledger. Hannah reached past Ethan and picked it up carefully, the way you handle something you already know matters. The cover was dark green, cloth-bound, slightly warped from years in that wall.
She opened it to the 1st page and stood very still. The entries inside were handwritten in a tight, neat script that Ryan could see, even over her shoulder, was her father's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. He could tell by the way her breath changed. The pages were filled with coded notes, abbreviations, numbers, location references that didn't immediately make sense. But scattered throughout were names of storage facilities, at least a dozen different ones listed across what appeared to be several years of entries. Near the back, one page was different from the rest. A single entry, circled 3 times in red ink. The circle was pressed hard into the paper, like whoever drew it wanted to make absolutely certain it couldn't be missed. Below the circle, 2 words had been written, separately from everything else on the page. "Find it." Hannah closed the ledger and held it against her chest for a moment without speaking. Ryan didn't say anything either. Some moments didn't need filling. Ethan was the one who finally broke the quiet, but not with words. He was crouching near the doorway, looking at the floor. "Someone's been here recently," he said. Ryan crossed the room and looked down. Near the doorframe, the dust had been disturbed. Footprints, more than one set, and the faint drag mark of something pulled across the floor, recent enough that the edges were still clean. "How recent?" Ryan asked. "Day or 2 at most." Ryan straightened and looked at Hannah. She was already looking at him, the ledger still pressed to her chest, and the expression on her face had shifted from emotional to alert. They were not alone in this search,
and whoever else was looking had a head start. They left Chicago at 6 the next morning. Ryan had suggested an early start, and nobody argued. The ledger had kept all three of them occupied well into the previous night, Hannah and Ethan working through the coded entries, while Ryan cross-referenced the storage facility names against property databases he had access to through his business network. By midnight, they'd narrowed the circled entry down to a rental contract registered under one of Robert Brooks's company name variations, last recorded in Springfield, Illinois. Someone else was looking for the same thing. That fact alone was enough to make an early start feel necessary. Hannah sat in the front passenger seat of Ryan's car. Ethan followed behind in his own truck, which Ryan had initially suggested wasn't necessary. There was room, but Hannah had given him a look that ended the conversation quickly. He drove, she navigated. The city thinned out behind them, and the highway opened up into flat Midwestern landscape, gray and quiet in the early morning light. For the first 40 minutes, neither of them said much. Ryan was comfortable with silence in the office. It was a professional silence, purposeful, contained. This felt different. This was two people sitting close together with no agenda between them and no scheduled meeting to break the quiet when it stretched too long. Hannah spoke first. "He used to take me on drives when I was small," she said, looking out at the passing fields. "My father. He said thinking worked better when you were moving. He'd pick me up from school sometimes and just drive for an hour before taking me home." Ryan glanced at her briefly. "What did you talk about?" "Everything. Nothing important." She paused. "He asked a lot of questions. What I thought about things. What I wanted to be. He was the kind of person who actually listened to the answer." Ryan kept his eyes on the road. "You don't talk about him much." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "It's been 4 years. Some days it still feels like I'm not ready to." He didn't push. They drove in silence for another stretch, and it was a different kind of silence than before, easier somehow. "Can I ask you something?" Hannah said. "Go ahead." "Why did you really come yesterday?"
To the building. Ryan considered the honest answer. "Because you were handling something alone that you didn't have to handle alone." She turned slightly to look at him. "That's not a business reason." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She faced forward again. He could see her processing that without making it into something bigger than it needed to be, which he appreciated. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said after a while. The request was casual, like she was asking about the weather. Ryan thought about it genuinely. "I used to want to be an architect." She turned to look at him again, and this time she looked genuinely surprised. "Seriously?" "I was decent at it. I liked the idea of building things that lasted." He paused. "My father had other plans." "What did he want?" "What he'd built. He wanted someone to take it over and grow it." Ryan kept his voice even. "So that's what I did." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" "Some days," he said honestly. "Less than I used to." She nodded slowly, like she understood that particular kind of answer, the one that's true but complicated. They reached Springfield just before 10 and went directly to the county records office, a low brick building near the center of town that smelled like carpet cleaner and old filing systems. Ethan met them at the entrance, a coffee in each hand, and passed one to Hannah without being asked. Ryan noted that. The clerk at the records desk was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head who seemed genuinely pleased to have something interesting to look up. Hannah provided her father's name and the company name variation from the ledger. The clerk disappeared into a back room and returned 20 minutes later with a manila folder that had a thin film of dust on the cover. Inside was an old rental contract. The facility name on the contract was printed at the top, Midland Storage and Lock. Below it, the unit number, a client signature that was unmistakably Robert Brooks, and a contract date from 11 years ago.
At the bottom of the second page, in the remarks section, someone had written a note in the same tight handwriting from the ledger. Final unit, everything that matters. And below that, a secondary address, not the facility's main address, but a street in a different city entirely, St. Louis, Missouri. Ethan leaned over and read it twice. He didn't store everything in one place, he said. He moved the final unit at some point, changed the location and updated the contract by hand. Which is why it never appeared in the original records search, Hannah said. Exactly, because the contract was amended manually and never digitized. Ryan studied the address. The facility on that street would be easy enough to find. How far is St. Louis from here? 2 hours south, Ethan said. Ryan straightened and looked at Hannah. She was still holding the rental contract, reading her father's handwriting in the remarks section again. We don't have to go today, Ryan said quietly. She looked up. We do, she said. Whoever searched that building in Chicago is working through the same trail we are. If we stop now, we lose whatever head start we have. She handed the contract back to the clerk for copying, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the door. Ryan watched her for a moment before following. Whatever Robert Brooks had left behind in St. Louis, his daughter was going to find it. And Ryan was going to make sure she got there safely. They arrived in St. Louis by early afternoon. The facility was on the western outskirts of the city, a long, low building surrounded by a chain-link fence, the kind of place that existed purely for function. No signage beyond the bare minimum. A small office at the entrance with a single attendant who looked like he'd been sitting in the same chair for 20 years. Ryan handled the paperwork. The rental contract from Springfield was enough to establish Hannah as the legal heir to the unit, and the attendant, a heavy-set man named Gerald who wore a cardinal's cap and spoke in slow, unhurried sentences, walked them through the process without asking unnecessary questions. It took 30 minutes. Ryan suspected it would have taken considerably longer without him, and he didn't say that out loud. Gerald led them down a long corridor between rows of orange rolling doors and stopped at Unit 114. He handed Hannah the key. She looked at it for a moment, a small, ordinary key on a plain metal ring, and Ryan watched something move across her face. 4 years of not knowing, months of searching, a gala, a ledger behind a wall panel, 3 cities, and a rental contract buried in a Springfield filing cabinet. All of it had led to this door. She put the key in the lock and turned it. The door rolled up with a low metallic sound. For a second, none of them moved. The unit was large, larger than any of them had expected. And it was full. Floor to ceiling on both sides, carefully stacked boxes, each one labeled in Robert Brooks' handwriting. Dozens of them. Between the boxes, manila envelopes rubber-banded into groups, 2 filing cabinets pushed against the back wall, and on top of one of them, a single framed photograph turned face down. Ryan stepped inside first and pulled the chain on the overhead light. There's no money in here, Ethan said quietly, scanning the boxes. He was right. Ryan had half expected cash, valuables, something hidden for purely personal reasons. What filled this room looked more like the archive of someone who had spent years documenting something very carefully and very deliberately. Hannah moved to the nearest box and opened it. Inside, documents, financial records, transaction histories, letters, photographs of people Ryan didn't recognize, some of them clearly taken without the subjects knowing. Hannah opened a second box, more of the same, but older. A third box contained handwritten journals and bound folders with typed reports inside. Ethan picked up one of the folders and read the first page in silence. His expression shifted. "Hannah," he said. She looked up. He held up the folder. "These are victim files." Ryan took the folder from him and read it carefully. The file contained the financial history of a family from downstate Illinois. Names, account records, a timeline of transactions, and a detailed account of how a sum of money had been taken from them through what appeared to be a fraudulent investment scheme.
At the back of the file was a handwritten note in Robert's writing, detailing steps he had taken to help the family recover a portion of what they'd lost. Ryan set the folder down and opened another. Different family. Same structure. Same careful documentation. Same note at the back. He opened a third. Then a fourth. Every single file followed the same pattern. "He was helping people," Hannah said. Her voice was very quiet. She was standing in the middle of the unit, holding an open journal, reading. "For years, he found families who lost money through these schemes, and he helped them get it back." She turned a page. "He used his own resources, his own contacts. He never filed anything official. He just quietly worked through it, on his own." "How many files are there?" Ethan asked. Ryan looked at the boxes. He counted quickly. "At least 60, maybe more." Hannah sat down slowly on the edge of one of the stacked boxes and kept reading the journal. Ryan watched her face as she moved through the pages. There was grief in it, but something else too. Something that looked like a door opening in a room she hadn't been able to enter in 4 years. Ryan crouched beside the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer. More files. More records. But organized differently in here. These appeared to be the financial records of the people who had run the schemes.
Names, business entities, transaction records, showing exactly where the stolen money had gone. Evidence. The kind that took years to build. "He documented the other side too," Ryan said. "The people responsible." Ethan looked over his shoulder. "That's why he kept it hidden. If these people knew he had this, they'd have come looking for it," Ryan finished. The thought settled over all three of them. Ryan stood and looked at the room again, with different eyes. This wasn't just a storage unit. It was the life's work of a man who had spent years doing something quietly important, alone, without recognition, without any guarantee that it would ever matter. Hannah turned the journal to a specific page and held it up. Written at the top in her father's handwriting were 3 words. "For my Hannah." She pressed the journal to her chest and looked up at the ceiling for a moment. Ryan looked away, giving her the privacy of it. The framed photograph on top of the filing cabinet caught his eye. He reached over and turned it face up. It was Hannah, younger, maybe 19 or 20, laughing at something off camera. Her father had kept a photograph of her here, in this room, among everything he'd spent years protecting. Ryan set it gently back down, face up this time. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting toward evening. None of them suggested leaving. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the boxes. Ryan organized. It was the most useful thing he could do, and he knew it. Hannah needed to be the one reading, the one absorbing, the one deciding what mattered and what could wait. So he worked quietly beside her, sorting files into categories, matching documents to the journals, creating a rough inventory of everything in the unit while Ethan photographed pages with his phone for backup. By 6 in the evening, they had a clearer picture. 63 families spread across Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Each one affected by the same financial scheme, or variations of it, operated through a network of shell companies over roughly a 12-year period. Robert Brooks had documented everything: the victims, the perpetrators, the money trails, and, in many cases, the partial recoveries he'd managed to arrange quietly through contacts Ryan could only guess at. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary body of work. But Hannah was frowning. Ryan noticed it while she was cross-referencing 2 journals side by side, moving between them with the focused expression she usually reserved for contracts that didn't add up. "What is it?" he asked. "There should be another journal." She set both down and looked at the open box in front of her. "The entries in this one reference a separate record. He calls it the Names Journal, a complete list of every victim, every contact, every step he took for each family." She picked up the journal again and found the page. "He mentions it 4 times. He kept it separate from everything else on purpose."
Separate how? Ethan asked. He doesn't say exactly, just that it was kept somewhere it wouldn't be found with the rest. She looked around at the boxes. We've been through everything in here. It's not in this unit. Ryan looked at the filing cabinets. They'd gone through both drawers carefully. No additional journal. He checked the back wall of the unit, running his hand along the surface the way Ethan had done in Chicago. Nothing gave. No hidden panels, no secondary compartment. He hid this entire unit for years, Ethan said slowly. If he kept something even more sensitive separate from this, he would have put it somewhere he trusted completely. Someone he trusted, Hannah said. Not somewhere. He wasn't the kind of person who trusted places. He trusted people. Ryan thought about that. Is there anyone from his life still in the area? Someone he was close to? Hannah was quiet for a moment. There was a man. He used to come to the house when I was a teenager, maybe 3 or 4 times over the years. My father never introduced him by anything except a first name, Bernard. He ran an antique bookstore, I think, somewhere in the city. She paused. I haven't thought about him in years. Bernard, Ethan repeated. That's something to work with. Ryan was already on his phone. It took him 15 minutes and 2 calls to find a Bernard Alcott, 71 years old, owner of a small bookstore called Alcott & Sons in the historic riverfront district of St. Louis. The store had been at the same address for 34 years. Hannah looked at Ryan when he read the name out. That's him, she said quietly. I remember the name of the store. My father mentioned it once. Alcott & Sons was exactly what the name suggested. Narrow, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old books thick in the air, a single lamp burning in the window even though the closed sign was already turned. Ryan knocked twice on the glass door. The man who appeared from between the shelves was tall and thin, with white hair and the unhurried movement of someone who had long ago stopped rushing anywhere. He looked through the glass at the 3 of them, and his eyes settled on Hannah. Something in his expression changed. He unlocked the door. You look like your father, he said to her before any of them introduced themselves. Hannah's breath caught slightly. You knew him? For 30 years. He stepped back to let them in. I wondered when someone would come. I hoped it would be you. He led them to a small sitting area at the back of the store, 4 mismatched chairs around a low table stacked with catalogs. He made tea without asking whether anyone wanted it and set the cups down before settling into his chair. Robert came to me 8 months before he passed, Bernard said. He didn't tell me he was ill. I found that out afterward. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He gave me something to keep and told me his daughter would come for it one day. He said she'd know what it was when she saw it. The journal, Hannah said. Bernard nodded. He made me promise not to hand it to anyone who came without you being present. It didn't matter who they were or what they said. He looked at Ryan and Ethan briefly. He was specific about that. He stood, moved to a shelf behind them, and slid out a book that looked identical to every other book around it. Behind it, fixed to the back of the shelf with a single piece of tape, was a slim, dark journal. He handed it to Hannah. She opened the cover. Inside, in her father's handwriting, was a single line at the top of the first page. If you're reading this, you were brave enough to look. I always knew you would be. The room was very quiet. Bernard reached into his cardigan pocket and produced an envelope. He also left this. He said to give it to you only after the journal. Hannah took the envelope. Her name was written on the front in her father's hand. She looked up at Bernard. Did he tell you what was in it? No. The old man smiled gently. But he told me where it would lead you. He looked toward the window and the dark river visible beyond it. Wisconsin, he said simply. They drove to Wisconsin the following morning. Hannah had opened the envelope the previous night, alone in her hotel room.
She hadn't shared its contents immediately, and Ryan hadn't asked. When she came down to the lobby at 7 with her bag packed and her eyes slightly red around the edges, he simply handed her a coffee and walked with her to the car. Some things needed to be carried privately before they could be shared. She told them what the letter said somewhere around the Illinois border, with flat farmland on both sides and the morning still pale and quiet. He wrote that the cabin belonged to a friend who passed away years ago. He used it sometimes when he needed to think. She kept her eyes on the road ahead.
He hid the journal there because he said it was the one place connected to his life that nobody else would ever think to look. She paused. He also wrote that he was sorry he never told me what he was doing. He thought he was protecting me. Ryan kept his hands on the wheel and said nothing. He said he wrote the letters at the cabin, that he went there in his last good months and wrote everything down that he hadn't been able to say out loud. She folded the envelope and held it in her lap. He wanted me to read them there, in that place. Ethan, sitting in the back seat, was quiet for a long moment. Did he say why there specifically? He said the light in the morning was the best he'd ever seen anywhere. Hannah's voice caught slightly on the last word. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window until it passed. Ryan adjusted his grip on the wheel. There was nothing useful to say, so he said nothing. Lake Geneva appeared in the early afternoon, a wide blue stretch of water ringed by trees that were just beginning to turn at the edges, autumn arriving slowly from the outside in. The town itself was small and unhurried, the kind of place that existed at a different pace than the cities they'd spent the last week moving through. The cabin was 3 miles outside of town on a gravel road that ran alongside the water. Ryan almost missed the turnoff. The structure itself was modest, wood-sided, a covered porch facing the lake, old enough to have settled comfortably into the land around it. Someone had maintained it well. The porch boards were solid underfoot, and the windows were clean. Hannah used the key from the envelope. Inside, the cabin was simple and quiet. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen, 2 small bedrooms. Furniture that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than appearance. On a shelf above the fireplace, a row of books and a small wooden clock that had stopped at some point and never been restarted. The desk was in the corner of the main room, facing the window that looked out over the lake. Hannah went straight to it. The journal was in the bottom drawer, exactly where the letter said it would be. Beside it, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, maybe 15 envelopes, each one numbered in sequence on the front. She sat down at the desk and untied them carefully. Ryan lit the fireplace because the cabin was cold and because doing something useful felt better than standing still. Ethan stepped outside to give her space. Ryan stayed inside, but moved to the far end of the room and gave her the quiet she needed. She read for a long time. The fire settled into a steady burn. Outside, the lake was flat and silver in the afternoon light. Ryan made coffee in the kitchen, found it surprisingly well stocked, and left a cup on the edge of the desk without interrupting. Hannah picked it up without looking away from the pages. When she finally set the last letter down, she sat with her hands folded on the desk and looked out at the water for a while. Then she turned to Ryan. "He helped 63 families," she said. "He spent 11 years doing it. He used almost everything he'd saved personally." She stopped. "That's why there was never much money when he died. I always thought he'd been careless with it. I thought he just hadn't planned well." She shook her head. "He gave it away. Every time he helped someone recover what they'd lost, he covered whatever gaps remained out of his own pocket." Ryan crossed the room and sat down in the chair near the desk. "He didn't want credit," Hannah continued. "He never contacted any of the families afterward to tell them who'd helped them. He just did it, and documented it so someone would know eventually." She touched the edge of the letter on top of the pile. "He wrote that he hoped I wouldn't be angry with him for keeping it secret. He thought I'd worry." "Would you have?" Ryan asked.
She considered it honestly. Yes, she said, and he knew me well enough to know that. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. He said I always worried about the wrong things instead of the important things. Ryan looked at her. That sounds familiar. She caught his meaning and held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the lake. He wrote about me in the letters, she said quietly, about what he hoped for me. He said he wanted me to find someone who noticed the things about me that I didn't think were worth noticing. She paused. He was always more romantic than practical. Ryan didn't respond immediately. He looked at the lake through the window and let the words sit in the room. Smart man, he said finally. Hannah looked at him. The fire crackled behind them. On the lake, a single bird moved low across the surface of the water and disappeared into the tree line. Neither of them looked away. They stayed at the cabin that night. It made more sense than driving back. The afternoon had given way to evening without any of them noticing, the way time moves when everyone in a room is focused on something that actually matters. Hannah spent 2 more hours with the letters, while Ryan and Ethan worked through the names journal at the kitchen table, cross-referencing the families listed against current addresses, phone numbers, any contact information that could still be valid after a decade. 63 families, spread across 4 states. Some entries had detailed contact information, others had only names and the name of a town. We'll find them, Ryan said, when Ethan pointed out the gaps. Ethan looked at him across the table. This is going to take weeks. Then it takes weeks. Ethan studied him for a moment, then looked back down at the journal without further comment. They returned to Chicago the following morning and began. Ryan cleared 2 weeks from his schedule. His assistant, his other assistant, a young man named Daniel who handled logistics and had been with the company 3 years, was given a revised calendar and a brief explanation that involved the phrase personal matter and nothing else. Daniel, to his credit, asked no questions. Hannah set up a workspace in the small conference room adjacent to Ryan's office. The documents from the storage unit were transported up from St. Louis and organized across the conference table, files grouped by state, journals open to the relevant pages, the names journal at the center of everything. She made the first call herself. Ryan heard her voice through the glass partition, steady, careful, explaining who she was and why she was calling. There was a long pause on her end, where the other person was clearly talking. Then Hannah's voice shifted into something softer, and she turned slightly away from the glass. Ryan looked back at his desk. The family was from Rockford, Illinois, a couple in their late 60s whose retirement savings had been significantly reduced through the scheme more than a decade ago. Robert Brooks had helped them recover roughly half of what they'd lost, through channels they'd apparently never fully understood at the time. They hadn't known who was responsible for the recovery, until now. Hannah came out of the conference room 20 minutes later. She leaned against the doorframe of Ryan's office, and he looked up from his desk. They cried, she said. Her voice was even, but her eyes were bright. They said they always suspected someone had helped them, but could never figure out who. They'd been wanting to say thank you for 11 years. Ryan held her gaze. First of 63. She straightened. First of 63, she agreed, and went back into the conference room. The next 12 days moved in a rhythm unlike anything Ryan's professional life had ever produced. Mornings were spent on calls, Hannah working through the list systematically, Ryan stepping in when a case required legal language or financial verification that needed more weight behind it. Some families were easy to reach, others required searching, updated addresses, new phone numbers. In 2 cases, a family member reached instead of the original person because the original person had since passed. Every conversation was different. Some families were emotional. Some were guarded at first, suspicious of why anyone was calling about something so old. One man in Springfield spent the first 10 minutes of the call convinced it was some kind of fraud before Hannah quietly read him specific details from her father's file that nobody could have invented. He went silent for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Your father was a good man. I always prayed someone in his family would know that someday." Hannah wrote it down in a notebook she kept beside the journal. Every call, she wrote down one thing that was said. Ryan noticed, but didn't mention it. Afternoons were often spent traveling. Some families lived close enough to Chicago that it made sense to visit in person, to hand over copies of the documentation, to sit across a table from people who deserved more than a phone call. Ryan drove. Hannah navigated. Ethan joined them on several trips, particularly when the addresses were in areas he knew well from his own network across the Midwest. The three of them developed an easy, unspoken rhythm. Ryan handled logistics and anything requiring formal verification. Hannah led every conversation, every meeting, every exchange that mattered. Ethan filled in the gaps between, finding addresses, tracing family members who'd moved, locating a woman in Indiana through a connection at a local auto shop that turned out to be 4 calls and 3 days of patient work. Ryan watched Ethan during those days. He was a good person, straightforward, reliable, genuinely invested in what they were doing. On the 9th day, driving back from a visit to a family in Peoria, Ethan rode with them instead of taking his own truck and spent most of the drive talking with Hannah about her father. Stories she was only now piecing together. Things the letters had revealed that she was still processing. Ryan listened from the front seat. At one point, Ethan caught his eye in the rearview mirror and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, quiet and without words, of exactly where things stood. Ethan gave the smallest nod. Ryan kept his eyes on the road. The following morning, Ethan mentioned casually that he had work backing up at the shop and would handle the remaining research remotely. He shook Ryan's hand at the office door and hugged Hannah for a long moment. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. Hannah held herself together until he was in the elevator. Ryan handed her a coffee and said nothing. She took it, steadied herself, and walked back into the conference room. 41 families down, 22 to go. The last call was made on a Tuesday afternoon. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret Holloway, 73 years old, living alone in a small house outside Milwaukee. She was the final name in the journal. The 63rd family, listed at the very bottom of the last page in Robert Brooks's careful handwriting, underlined once. Hannah had saved her for last without explaining why. Ryan suspected it was because the file was the thinnest of all of them, least information, hardest to trace, the one that had required the most work to close. He'd spent 3 days personally verifying the financial trail before Hannah was satisfied the information was complete enough to share. Margaret answered on the second ring. Hannah spoke for about 20 minutes. Ryan sat at his desk on the other side of the partition and made no attempt to pretend he wasn't listening. He heard Hannah explain who she was, explain what her father had done, explain that the documentation was ready to be shared whenever Margaret wanted it. Then Hannah went quiet for a long stretch. When she spoke again, her voice was lower.
"He wrote about you specifically," she said. "He said your case was the one that made him certain he was doing the right thing. He wrote—" She paused, and Ryan could hear paper turning. "He wrote that you reminded him why ordinary people deserved someone in their corner." Another long silence from Hannah's end. "You're very welcome," she said finally. "I'll be in touch about the documents." She ended the call. Ryan waited. She appeared in his doorway 30 seconds later, notebook in hand, and wrote something down on the last page. She stared at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, set it on the corner of his desk, and looked at him. "That's all of them," she said. The words landed simply, without drama. 63 families, 3 weeks, 4 states, 1 storage unit, 1 hidden ledger, 1 antique bookstore, 1 cabin on a lake in Wisconsin,
and more miles of highway than either of them had counted. Ryan leaned back in his chair. "How do you feel?" She thought about it genuinely. "Like I can breathe properly for the first time in 4 years." He nodded slowly. "Good." She looked at the notebook on his desk. "Thank you for all of it. You didn't have to do any of this." "I know." "Ryan, Hannah," he said it quietly, not cutting her off exactly, just settling the room. "You don't need to thank me." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked out the window at the city. The afternoon light was angled and gold, the kind that only appeared in Chicago for a few weeks in early autumn before the gray moved in and stayed. "I'm going home," she said. "I think I need a very long sleep. Take tomorrow off." She looked back at him. "I never take days off." "I know. Take it anyway." She considered arguing, the way she usually did when he said something she didn't expect. Then she picked up her bag from the chair by the door. "Good night, Ryan. Good night." He called her the following evening, not about work. He let that fact exist without over-explaining it, and simply asked if she'd eaten and whether she wanted to walk. She was quiet for a second, the kind of quiet that meant she was deciding something. "Where?" she asked. "The Riverwalk. 1/2 an hour." She was already there when he arrived, standing at the railing above the water, her coat pulled close, watching a boat move slowly under the bridge. The city hummed around them at a comfortable distance. Down here the air smelled like the river, and the evening was cool without being cold. He stood beside her at the railing. For a few minutes they just watched the water. No agenda between them. No storage units, no documents, no more names in a journal. Just the river and the city lights beginning to reflect across its surface as the sky darkened. "Can I tell you something?" Ryan said. "You're going to regardless," she said, which made him smile. "The night of the gala, when I saw you dancing with Ethan." He kept his eyes on the water. "I told myself I was concerned because I didn't know who he was, that it was reasonable caution." He paused. That was not what it was. Hannah was quiet beside him. "I stood at the edge of that ballroom and watched you laugh, and I realized I had no idea what your laugh actually looked like. 5 years, and I'd somehow missed that." He turned to look at her. "That bothered me more than I knew how to handle at the time." She turned to face him. In the glow from the bridge lights, her expression was open in the way it had been at the gala. Unguarded, honest, the version of her that existed outside the office. "I noticed," she said. "I know you did. You were very obvious about it." "I'm aware." The corner of her mouth lifted. "You followed us to a coffee shop." "I did." "And then to the building in the industrial district." "Also true." She looked at him for a long moment. "For a man who runs a very large operation, you are surprisingly bad at being subtle." "Only apparently with you," he said. She laughed, that same open, unguarded laugh from the gala, the one he'd been watching from across the ballroom 3 weeks ago when everything started. Up close it was even better. "So what happens now?" she asked. Ryan looked at the river, then back at her. "I think we stopped pretending the last 3 weeks were just professional." She held his gaze. The city moved around them, unhurried and indifferent, doing what cities do. "Okay," she said simply. Not a grand declaration, not a dramatic moment, just 2 people standing beside a river in the autumn evening, deciding that something true was worth saying out loud. Ryan stayed beside her, and they walked. No mystery left to solve, no trail left to follow, just the river, the lights, and the easy quiet of 2 people who had finally stopped pretending they were only colleagues. It was, by a considerable distance, the best evening Ryan Mercer had spent in years.